Well, here we are again, those of you who actually want to continue the course, or those of you who are just listening in. I'm waiting for some of you to send me your life story and your photo. Get down to it. Okay. Now we're going to continue our puzzle, not the puzzle with the fingers, but the puzzle with the letters. We're going to continue teasing. The problem is the teasing working? There's an old Irish song which I'm not going to sing, and it says, love is pleasing and love is teasing, and love's a wonder when first it's new, but when it's older, love grows colder and fades away like the morning dew. And that need not be. Neither love nor wonder need fade. A few people contacted me during the week and felt there was a pessimism. Now, I'm a long-term optimist, but I'm a short-term pessimist. And part of my pessimism comes out in the points I made last week, that somehow keeping new is not on. It is much more bureaucratically sound to keep people merely on the level of being talking animals. Keep things stable. And the situation is one described by Bernard Lonergan as a slum. On page 99 of his book, Method in Theology, he says, where once there were joys and sorrows, now there are mere pleasures and pains. The civilization has become a slum. That, I think, is the situation, and I mentioned Gadamer's view of the university's education as narcotized receptivity. That's a great German thinker, recognized as a leading 20th century thinker. Eric Voegelin, another man I mentioned or will mention again, talks about the murderous grotesque of our time. And the problem is, can we discover that we don't fit, and that there's an enormous collaboration in fitting us in? Some of us at the age of 20, 21, 22, we're told to settle down. Why? Okay, we're going to go back over the last week's lecture, and I told you it would be like that. We're going to go round and round slowly. First, I list my points for the 2-hour session. And as I mentioned last week, I always do this, and sometimes we never get to the end. So we've got 7 topics tonight. First topic is prevision, which includes revision. Second topic is identification. Of elements. And let me write in of meaning. We're trying to identify ourselves. The third topic is horizons. I'm not putting in the references here because you've got it on the outline. This is mainly chapter 1 of the book Wealth. Chapter 4 is, again, techniques. We talked about that the last day, and we ended up with that problem of a technique for multiplying. Did you all work that out? Okay. Topic 5 is a famous woman, Helen Keller. How many of you have heard of this woman, Helen Keller? Few people. Okay. Topic 6 is another woman. Molly Bloom, but the real topic is minding. And topic 7 is reasoning towards fact. And we're back into P, that's process, chapter 2, section 5, into those horrible puzzles. Okay, let's start with the prevision. There's a sense in which it says it all. Like Mahler saying Mozart. I could stand here and say prevision. What do I mean? I mean us. There's a sense in which that's what distinguishes us from the animals. A prevision. Now I'm going to tie this up with the puzzle which some of you solved. How many people solved that problem? A, B, C, D, E, F? Yeah? Well, that's not bad. You don't know? Well, that's not bad either. As long as you tried. Okay, the puzzle was A, B, C, D, E, F, dot, dot, dot. Now, a simple way of saying what is a human being. A human being, as distinct from a dog sitting here, does something with the dots. Fair enough? Yeah? Like if I write down, say, 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, dot, dot, dot. Doesn't something happen to you? Yeah? Oh, come on, yeah? It's terribly simple. It's not just dot, 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 is it? Yeah? Doesn't something happen, yeah? Yeah? And what happens? You jump ahead, yeah, and you can actually say, can't you? Yeah? Anyone help me out here? 2, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 16, yeah? You prevision. That's the sort of thing we are. And our effort here is to rescue that on a large scale. But only personally here. We're not trying to change the universe. It's to discover that, yeah, I'm this sort of thing that previses. I'm a previsor. And that's what we're talking about when I talk about that. Me as quest, a questioner. Don't think of questions academically. When I put academically in quotation marks, I mean barnyard materially. Academic for Plato meant I'm very serious. Academus was a friend who lent him his backyard. And Plato was very serious. And Plato was enormously previsioning. He was quite a crazy fellow. He wrote a book about a republic, trying to prevision how people might live together. Well, what is the good life? That's terrific prevision. Yeah? And animals don't do that. There's that marvelous cartoonist, what's his name? Larson. And he has these cartoons of, say, the cow standing up in the field, and one of them is watching out in case a motorist passes because the motorist thinks that all the cows stand around on 4 feet. Huh? How many of you know Gary Larson's cartoons? They're a treat, aren't they? Okay, so we have prevision, maybe. And it's when I get to the maybe that the pessimism can settle in. There's a sort of a massive conspiracy in the 20th century to level us out, mistakenly called democracy. Yeah. Okay, so we could spend the rest of the 2 hours, indeed the rest of the course, talking about these dots. And you say, McShane is dotty. Okay, that's us. We are a prevision. Is it important to do these puzzles? Well, I'm trying to get you to discover something that you have been sidetracked from. With the class today, we did what's called Boyle's Law. But we did it in an interesting fashion, with a glass of water in a sink, and it was great fun. And this actually awakened. It's a shock sometimes when you find that, geez, people are still alive. It's by doing little puzzles that you discover how to handle the big things. If this took you 2 hours, how long do you think it's going to take to discover the meaning of the ups and downs in life? Or the ups and downs in the economy? I'm going to get to the question of the economy slowly. But the big thing is, we are a prevision of making sense. In this case, no problem. 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, ... Some of the puzzles I give you in this section take you a little longer. Now, when I say we are a prevision, and I'm anticipating now this duplication, I draw your attention to you and me as previsions, as questioners. And as questioners who sometimes get insights, which I symbolize by this exclamation mark. Because when you do have an insight, there's a sort of a click. Are you familiar with that? Like with the joke. You get it, yeah. And there's a shift. Same if you're solving a mathematical problem or figuring out the problems of a friendship. There's a jump. You can get there. Now, what we're trying to do here is what's called, by certain people, let me quote the person, by Bernard Lonergan, the Canadian thinker. I mentioned him already. I will talk about him again. He claims to have discovered the theorem I mentioned the last day. He discovered that theorem in Thomas Aquinas and in Aristotle. And part of his view is that that theorem disappeared after the death of Aristotle. I'm always confusing Aristotle and Alexander, but I think they died within a year of each other, 322 BC. And Thomas died in 1274 AD, March the 7th, and the university condemned his views on March the 7th, 1277. I always enjoy that as noticing the cynicism. Can you imagine the people in a university saying, say, on March the 7th, you know, he's 3 years dead today. I think we should condemn him. Okay. So the theorem is that if you want to understand, you have to puzzle about whatever mess there is, whether it's the events in one's life or a little bit of a puzzle. And you have to mess and puzzle. Yeah? And maybe that happens. And when that happens, you have a serious concept. And if you have a serious concept, you may talk about it, okay? And this is where the trouble comes in, and we will be on this topic for half the course. You get a serious understanding. Let's take somebody like Newton. You all heard of Newton, yeah? The chap who discovered gravity. I think Larson has a cartoon where and Newton is sitting under a tree, and his friends are all sitting under apple trees, and one underneath it says, well, nothing so far, but there's a huge apple over Newton. Okay. It took Newton a couple of weeks, solid thinking. And the story is that he wasn't eating, that eventually when he came out, so to speak, of his study, there were meals buried under notes and so on. He had mucked around and he came up with this terrific set of insights known as gravitation. Now, many of you know the law of gravitation. Yeah? It can be summarily written down, and he wrote it down, that if you have two bodies, the Earth and the Sun, then they pull each other. According to the formula, ms, mass of the Sun, mass of the Earth, over r squared. Okay? That's an expression of a serious concept which Newton had. Okay? Now, you've got to think about this. What happens in a culture in decay? You never do this. You can do a first-year physics course in Harvard, in Oxford, and if the professor is not alive, you can memorize that. Fair enough? What have you done? You have done nothing. That's a name. But you can get the notion that, yeah, we learned the law of gravity today. No, you didn't. To learn the law of gravity, to understand it, means, yeah, there's a lot of work. And you get a serious concept. Now that's our basic theorem. That's the direction we're pushing in. That was number 6 in our list of 9 topics last week. Have you got it? Oh, God, heavens no. I know in my own case it took me about 6 years to get it. And you'll notice when you read page 90 of Process, that puzzle is on the bottom half. On the top half of page 90, the point is made that St. Augustine was a very bright man, and it took him about 10 years to figure out something. Now that should be an encouragement. Some students get the notion that I must be very stupid. I'm not getting this. No, you're human. We talked about that last week, and I want more feedback about that. Newton took weeks. Newton had a background from a chap called Kepler, famous crazy astronomer, lived at the time of Galileo. He spent 10 years figuring out that the Earth went round the Sun in an elliptic orbit. It wasn't a circle. And then a few other details. It's a slow business. Now what we're doing here is a slow business. You remember my points of last week when I talked about the 5 points in the course? Let's go backwards through them. It's a peak at a peak. You have the notes possibly. The other direction. It's slow. It's not memory. It's slow. It's circular. Yeah? And we're doing that. It's humorous, and it's a peak at a peak. A peak at a peak. Okay? Now what you've got to think about personally is, do you resent me saying that? Sometimes, nobody in this course so far has said it, but sometimes people say to me, this book is very difficult. My reply is always, Are you obvious? It's a peek at a peak. What's the peak? The peak is the prevision that is you. I mentioned last week, I quoted St. Augustine, the prayerful perspective of Augustine. Thou hast created us for thyself, and our hearts are restless till they rest in thee. The restless heart, that's what we're talking about. It's a longing. And a longing is very disruptive. I talked about the way we abuse children mentally, because that longing comes out at the age of 2, 3. It can be satisfied in the 6-month-old baby by sounds and bells and colors. Yeah. In the book I mentioned Clara Schumann, who was Clara Weich, Schumann's wife. She just lived in the world of music. I quote her biography where she says she couldn't even talk. She was so much into music that talking wasn't part of her thing at all. We see a different woman here in Helen Keller. But you have to think and say, is this guy having me on? That really I'm a search for something and it's quite beyond me. A peek at a peak. It's a very different notion from doing an in-depth credit on reason and religious belief. This is not an in-depth credit. The in-depth credit you get is life. And you pay for it, not in dollars. Okay, because it's ups and downs. Okay, so a peek at a peak. It's humorous. God, you need a sense of humor. Now, last week I talked about the Czech invasion and started saying, well, the Russians may have beaten them down now, 1968, but they can still laugh. But if you enlarge that to include the entire culture, yeah, North America, global, the oppression in China, and the subtle oppressions, there's a sense in which unsubtle oppression, it's much easier. Yeah? There's a sense in which it's better to be in Belsen than in Boston. Yeah? There's an insidiousness about the neon god, a comfortable zombiehood. I've talked to people who got out of places like Belsen, and they talk about the search for meaning, and these people are alive. They may have no flesh, no flesh, just skin and bone. Oh, I'm not going into the grim side. But what I want you to notice is that there can be a very glossy sort of death. Yeah? The city becomes an enormous funeral parlor. Am I being sufficiently cheerful? So in that context, oh, you need a joke. Okay, circular, slow, and not memory. Now, when I say not memory, I mean not memorization. Okay? There's memory in two senses, which I derive from a French philosopher, Bergson. Mémoire qui fiche, mémoire qui revit, a memory that relives. You may find in this course that you have to go back. When we touch page 34 of the book, Molly Bloom going back 16 years, I may be asking you to go back to remembering when I was a really interested little girl of 3. Yeah? And many of you can vaguely remember that bright, interested person that you were. Yeah, vaguely. Okay, so it's not memorization. You can memorize that and you haven't learned any physics. I read over a study of the reform of courses in Harvard. It's a decade now, and they put in some of these. They wanted the people to be educated broadly. So they had one large committee, and it invented about 8 other committees. That's the way things go in some of these places. But one of the things they invented was an in-depth course on the history of physics from sort of the beginning right up to Dirac, quantum mechanics. What do? They simply get the names of people and notice some of this stuff. They don't do anything like think. When we get to this, you'll notice no horizon shift at all. Okay, so we got this superficial half credit. That's the beginnings of an enterprise. And you may not follow it up, but at least notice that you're not following it up. You may have settled down, this is very disturbing. But try and not resent the possibility, especially in other people. There's a way in which resentment, the French is much better, ressentiment. Somehow there's more guts in the French. Somehow I sometimes think that Joyce would have been better off writing in French like Beckett. Samuel Beckett wrote in both languages. Or in Irish, that would have been marvelous. But there is a way in which we can subtly resent, demean, belittle, like the professor of music I mentioned maybe last week, who would lecture on Beethoven and say, this is all he did. No, the problem of the peak, as I drew the diagram last week, is that my function is to point way beyond me and you, because some of you may go way beyond my little struggle at the bottom of the hill. Huh? There may be some visionaries there, some incipient visionaries. Somebody, you know, life begins at 64. There may be somebody out there at the age of 63, and by golly, yeah, I'm ready to start. Okay? And of course, you know, you can get to the mountain without paying your fees and that. That's a terrific thing about getting to retirement age. Okay. So that's the question of prevision, which we'll return to down here when we get to Molly Bloom. The next job is identifying the elements. And I'm actually going to risk doing that. Now, it's a risk, and I want you to notice the risk. Identifying the elements of meaning. Okay, let's stay on this blackboard. Now, I gave you the page with this paralleled with chemistry. I have here my periodic chart. It's from the chemistry textbook I use as a background. The chart of elements. It's actually inside the cover of this textbook. It's a textbook used in the university in chemistry. I'm not sure what it is. It may be 120 or something like that. And you can read it and you can say, oh, these are the chemical elements. Many of you have some notion of these elements, yeah? Done chemistry, learned them in school, learned some of them in school. So you can say, well, I identify them. Well, no, you didn't. No, identifying them is something else. And it takes a very good teacher to identify the elements. When I was in the university, I had a very bad teacher. He just read the textbook at us. There were no experiments in class. He never showed us anything like a lump of lead. Huh? Pass a lump of lead around the class so that we can feel it, and then pass a lump of gold around the class and it disappears. But at least you can see here the list of elements, and they're connected, okay? And you have hydrogen on two sides. And you find that the inert gases are down one column. That somehow these are the same. Many of you know that much about chemistry, yeah? That this not only gives you a list, it's not a list of the elements, it sort of indicates the connections. Now, these elements have a long history, and it's important for our progress into the human elements to notice that. Chemistry is probably the oldest science. You find chemistry's origins in China, around the Mesopotamian basin, in Egypt. You find it way back. We call one age the Bronze Age, the Iron, so on. The Greeks talked about 4 elements: fire, air, earth, and water. And they're terribly plausible, you know. That everything is made up of a mix of these. And gradually over the centuries, people discovered that there are more elements. But it wasn't until 1865 that 2 different people figured out the connections in this sense. A German chemist called Mayer and a Russian called Mendeleev. Mendeleev generally gets the credit for this. They published the papers around 1865, 66. They weren't really accepted until 1870 and after. But these are now accepted. Now, in the case of the human elements that we're going to talk about, which you have in a chart, you can look at them. Or if you haven't got the chart, we sent it out by post, but you know the post can be quite slow, especially if it's in Dartmouth. I mean, getting across the bridge is quite a hassle. The elements I'm talking about are on page 100 of Process, and they're split up in the little book Wealth, page 15 and page 48. You get these elements. And I'll write out, why not? What are these elements? Well, there's sensibility. Okay, now, what am I going to do now? You needn't write this down, you've got it in your books. I'm going to switch now to the question of identification. If I was teaching chemistry, I could, in fact, quite easily, not that easily, I could produce a half a dozen elements. If you think of it, it's very hard to get elements, you know. I could say, today we're going to study oxygen. But I'd be grabbing at nitrogen as well, you know, or whatever. Carbon dioxide and so on. We could probably find a bit of iron in the room. There are a few elements. Maybe a bit of gold, you couldn't be sure. Silver. Nickel. Okay, now, so, and that would be doing good chemistry. You start with the experience of, say, mercury. Is there a thermometer in the room? Have you ever played with mercury? It's great fun, yeah? You get a thermometer and you break the end of it, and then you chase these little balls all around the table. It's marvelous, yeah? Okay, now, what I'm doing now is asking you to identify. Identify what? Elements of me. Okay, and it's not that difficult to notice that I have sensibility. Yeah? I see, hear, taste, touch. I smell in the active sense, or in the other sense too. And I have got kinesthetic sensibility, balance. The sort of thing that would help me to notice that there's an earthquake in Halifax at the moment, or whatever. I think of the Scots song, I belong to Glasgow, Glasgow dear old tune. What's the matter with Glasgow? For it's going Orun and Orun. Anyone know that song? Surely you Nova Scotians know a few Scots songs. He has a few drinks on a Saturday night and Glasgow goes Orun and Orun. The only song you Nova Scotians seem to know is Farewell to Nova Scotia. All right. So you've got sensibility, and it's a very complex part of you, and we'll touch on it later when we talk about art in its relation to religion. But simply you have these things like sight. We'll talk about Helen Keller later who didn't have sight. You have something in you which I've been talking about, prevision. Which makes you what? Now notice I didn't say ask what. It's prior to saying what. Qu'est-ce que? It's something in you that gives rise to this language. You'll find it in one-year-old children. Yeah? That's an element, and we're trying to identify it. Okay? Are we making some sense here? It's almost too obvious, isn't it? But yeah, of course there is, yeah. Whaters, yeah. And the what is in relation to, what's that noise? What's that smell? And if you what? Seriously, you can catch on. And that's what we're doing with these puzzles. Why do I take these simple puzzles? Because more complex insights would take us months, like Kepler. But some of these only take about 8 hours. Yeah? And this is an element in you. And one of the reasons I tell jokes is to guarantee that the class at least gets one insight in the hour, if you get the jokes. It's a jump. You hear the narrative. You're making sense of it, but you don't really make sense of it until you get the point. Ah, wow. You know what you get if you cross a Jehovah's Witness with an atheist? Somebody that knocks on your door for no particular reason. I know I'll get letters about that one. Okay, there's a jump. And that jump, as I say, gives rise to, and I'm using the word serious very deliberately, a serious concept. Now, why I'm using that is because the word concept in our culture, apart from the Irish use of English, which doesn't use this word the same way, the word concept is used regularly for name or expression. I'm returning to a more fundamental, if you like, Thomist Aristotelian notion that a concept, if you have a serious concept, it's not just a name. Now, there are a few tests for that, and it's tremendously refreshing to find out by these tests that actually you have pretty well no concepts whatsoever. You can sort of say, gosh, it's great, I know nothing. I'm like Socrates. It's very, but don't tell the other professors. A serious concept, for instance, when you don't have a serious concept, we talked about that last week, you memorize, say in school, the definition of a circle. And you all did that, didn't you? Something like that. You have memorized definitions, haven't you? Yeah? Occasionally. And they slip away. Love is pleasing, love, and they fade away like the morning dew. Well, you hope if it's for an exam in the morning, they won't fade away until afternoon. What is going on? You're not actually understanding the round thing. You're learning a long name. Now, to retain the long name, you'd have to repeat it regularly. You can imagine a family of namers or name droppers, and the parents insist that you use the long names. So mother says to little Johnny, would you go into the kitchen and bring out the locus of coplanar points equidistant from a fixed point plate? Yeah? Then little Johnny would learn how to talk that way. Yeah? So instead of buying a round of drinks, he'd buy a locus of coplanar points equidistant from fixed drinks. And as the night gets later, he loses grip on the definition. Okay, so you can learn a longer name for the same problem, and you're no wiser. Sometimes I joke about some types of sociology where you put a long name on an ordinary thing and you're no wiser. there's a thing that people have called a chat. I don't mean the French for cat. Chat, you know, we were chatting. Now you can call that a dyadic encounter, or a triadic encounter, yeah? Or a multifaceted interfacing of, yeah? Are you any wiser? No, it's still a chat, and what have you understood about it? Nothing. Gosh, I'm waking somebody up, that's great. So a serious concept is something you get from puzzling about a situation and getting insight. And that is, it's not a common theorem. I'm now talking about these elements. These first four elements are not part of our heritage the way these are. The sad situation in history is that because of accidents of books of Aristotle, Aquinas' condemnation, so on, these elements are quite neglected. I gave you the exercise, and it's given in the book, of checking out indices on this. Now, a stray word on feminism. There is such a thing as feminine intuition. And some feminist thinkers talk about a sort of a patriarchal view of mind. Okay? Now, there is an erroneous view of mind and of reasoning, and I began talking about it the last day. It is not patriarchal, it is simply erroneous. Oh yeah, the males are caught up in it. Some of my students tell me about, say, going out with the husband to buy a car, and the woman has an intuition. Yeah? But the husband is terribly logical, and he sees the price is right and so on. And there's some sense in which, yeah, right on, and a month later it's a lemon. So we're trying to rescue intuition. That leap regarding the concrete. Okay, but the mistake is not internal to the male psyche, it's just a cultural mistake. That reasoning, the meaning of reasoning, has been missed in the Western tradition. So we've got these first four elements, and it's tough work discovering them, and that's why we've got to do a lot of these exercises. Now, I could get lost in the details of where these emerged, but I won't. I'll just simply give you a little hint, just to give you the problem in its historical context. The man who really pushed this was that strange genius Socrates. Socrates, a strange Greek, wrote nothing, but was a puzzler. He was a whatter. He was a very discomforting whatter. He corrupted the youth in Athens. In the summer of 399 BC, he was condemned and executed he took poison. So that got rid of him. Plato was around at the time, I think in his late 20s. He didn't go to the execution. I think he was so stunned he went off and got pickled out of his mind and headed off and talked to a guy called Euclid. Not the Euclid that wrote the book. Euclid in Greek is like Murphy in Ireland. So he went, stayed with this fellow Euclid, and he learned geometry. And he had serious concepts, circle and so on. We'll talk about that a little later. Plato put the emphasis on serious concepts. And he certainly knew that round, that looking thing, is very different from, well, I'll use a later indication of circularity that comes with Descartes. That doesn't look like that. What does that mean? It means a serious concept. So Plato pushed this element, a theory of forms the experts will tell you about. Aristotle, now these guys are all sort of, this is like granddaddy, daddy, and son in their ages. I think Socrates died in 399. I think Plato died in 347 BC. I think that's pretty well it. Aristotle, who studied with Plato in Academus's backyard, he figured out that you get from there to there by doing this. Now, we've got to try and identify that, do we? Or do you do it the other way? Go from premises to conclusion. That's our problem. Okay, to identify. Now, I can see we're not going to get through the 7 points tonight, but what the hell, we're having fun, are we? Okay, identifying. You see what I mean? You have to notice, yeah, I used to do that. I've done it for a while. But, huh? Yeah, and I get the odd insight. Do I have the serious concept? Well, my first test was, have you forgotten it? Well, then it wasn't serious at the beginning. It was only a name. If you understand, you don't forget. It sticks with you. You don't need the words. You haven't memorized. Does that make sense to you? It's part of you. I don't have to go back to a book to find out the definition of an ellipse, a circle, etc. But I haven't done mathematics formally since the 50s. Now that's one test. The other test is a serious concept. Well, do I remember the months and years I spent getting it? And can I talk steadily and non-repetitively and coherently for 10 hours? Now, somebody here must be saying, you've got to be kidding. I'm not. So the problem is, we use the word concept enormously in North American culture, and it really only means name, but it sounds so heavy. But it's up to you to suspect. Quietly, you don't even tell your friends. You go home like Socrates and find out, I know nothing. I don't know, did I tell the story of Socrates last day? People said he was the wisest of men. And Socrates, I think he was sort of in middle age at that stage. He went on a tour of the wise zones of Greece, and he came back and he says, it's true, because they don't know anything, but I know I don't know anything. Okay, identifying the elements. So that's the first 4 elements. Now, if you did this puzzle, you got a certain distance. You got a solution. I had a phone call from somebody before I set out for the class tonight, and this person said, I think I've got another solution, and he talked. Now, we talked it out in front of them. Look, it's not any different than the one we had. But you figure out something about the situation, and it may be totally off. Think of, say, reading an Agatha Christie novel, and you come up with your idea of the killer, and you read on, and you find, no, I'm not on the ball. So you get a concept, and it may not be right on. And you have this element in you that is. Can you identify that element, is? How many of you have ised today? Izzy? Yeah? Yeah? You've ised, have you? Now, I notice some of you nodding, so some of you have nodded today. Is that true? Yeah? Give us another nod. Yeah? Yeah, you nodded. What happens between the ising and the nodding? It's not just a reflex, is it? It can be. You're with a very boring person and they're talking at you, and your mind's miles away, and you're... Come on, you've all done that, haven't you? Yeah? Oh yeah, oh yeah, oh yeah. Okay, but if you're doing it properly, the is about, well, am I really on the ball? And whew, yeah, There's a yes. There's that jump. The French wit de la Rochefoucauld, in the salons, they had these witty afternoons, and he has a lot of these aphorisms, and one of his aphorisms is, we always allow people to question our memory but not our judgment. And you're willing to say to yourself, oh, I really have a shocking memory. I have a shocking bad memory. But you rarely say, I really have very bad judgment. Yeah? Isn't that true? Many here sort of go around saying, oh, I really have very bad judgment. Well, you may. But generally, you think your judgment is something internal to you. You take a stand on it. Yeah. It comes from an inside. Now, I'm anticipating this reasoning towards fact. You'll have to do all these exercises, I'm sure of that, as we go along, time running short. What is reasoning towards fact? It's coming up with yes. Yeah. Is the light on in the room? And many of you are willing to nod. Yeah. Is the door open at the back of the room? Yeah. You out there in TV land, normally your TV is not sitting in front of the door. I noticed that in this culture. You don't have the TV in the box so that people come in the door and fall over it. Is the door closed? Now, up till now, you may have thought, well, yeah, and look at the damn thing, yeah? I'm trying to get you to notice that a lot more is going on. Suppose I said, on Willan Doris Dunta. Sounds great, doesn't it? On Willan Doris Dunta, Erchulan Thiomra. There may be a few mad Gaels out there that know what I'm talking about. Is the door at the back of the room open? Now you're sitting there watching me in the class or on the box. And I make a noise. I made it in Gaelic. Well, the guy has really gone off. I have a friend once who was lecturing. He had just come back from Germany doing his doctorate, and he started lecturing in his Marquette University, and he forgot himself, and he talked for about 20 minutes in German, and he didn't notice. Great attentive class. Okay, so reasoning towards fact is a lot more complicated than you suspected up till now. And you have to try and notice that. Okay? I'm sure that if I said, how do you know the light is on in the room, you would say, well, I look at it. Isn't that true? Yeah? Well, I don't think it's true, and I want you to find out that it's not true. Okay, so I'm identifying elements, and these are the first 7, and they're in the book Wealth, Chapter 2. And it's the diagram on page 15, and it's what we will tackle when we do more puzzles. Okay. I've identified only 7 of the elements. You'll find that there are 7 more on this page. Action, and that's next week's topic. Next topic, I just want to introduce it, is the question of horizons, and it's the one I've been talking about from the beginning. We have something in us that can go beyond where we are at the moment. Broaden your horizon. You know that phrase, yeah? You can broaden your horizon. Now, what I've been doing over here, talking about Socrates, Euclid, Einstein, is indicating that there's a horizon beyond naming and common sense. That you can ask what, and if you persevere with it, you get a completely different view on, say, round, or on energy, or on apples falling. And it's quite different from the horizon of common sense. And the way I will envisage it is in terms of circles. You have a horizon. For instance, if you go up a hill, you have a bigger visual horizon. You have a horizon of common sense, and there is a horizon of science, serious understanding, that is quite beyond common sense. And what we're interested in here is a further horizon. If you like, there's common sense, there's serious minding, and then there's minding. And that's what we're aiming at doing in philosophy of religion. And a key problem is to be open to the fact that it is difficult. It may not be your scene at all, but don't resent it. You don't have to go through these horizons to be human. Socrates didn't push through, but Socrates was tremendously human. Jesus knew nothing about Einstein's theory of relativity, but he was quite a guy. So this is not an essential of life. But in this course, we'll try and indicate that, yeah, there are horizons of understanding, and one of our problems is to appreciate that they're there so that we stop just talking nonsense. On page 18 of Wealth, and we will deal with that through here, there's a quotation from Bernard Lonergan's Insight, page 542, about Socrates. Socrates discomforted people by pointing out that you don't understand courage merely by being courageous. Now that can be enormously resented. Can you imagine a hero coming back from Vietnam and meeting Socrates, and Socrates saying, "What is courage?" And this guy is limping off the plane. And Socrates says, "No, you don't know what courage is." The hell I don't. Understanding courage is quite a different thing. That's very difficult to work with, but we'll try. Okay?